As you see, we have many contributors in this work, and I wanted to acknowledge all of them here. Okay, we're moving to next slides now. We are all aware of these two diseases, yellow spot and septoria nodorum blotch. They are the most common foliar diseases in Australia as well as in WA, of course. And between the two diseases, yellow spot is the predominant in WA, especially in northern agricultural region. And septoria nodorum blotch is often associated with yellow spot and treated separately, similarly. Response of these two diseases to fungicide cannot be evident from a single experiment, especially when we have complex questions to answer, such as, does the yield response vary between seasons, varieties, fungicide products, number of fungicide applications, and geographical locations? And questions like, I am in a high rainfall zone of north, when I will spray, at what growth of stage of plant? Infection is less than 10%, what would I do? We have used meta-analysis to answer these questions. What does meta-analysis do? Meta-analysis gives a general quantitative conclusion from many experiments that a single experiment cannot do. In the analysis, we have calculated the response of fungicide treatment in relation to control treatment, which are named as data points. In the analysis, we have considered variance within and between experiments to standardize yield response across the experiment. For each yield response, we calculated 95% confidence interval. Just to refresh our statistical knowledge, I would say when confidence intervals of two responses overlap, the difference between the two responses is not significant. We are more rely on confidence interval range rather than p-value here in meta-analysis. It is appropriate for meta-analysis when we are aggregating many years data. We have calculated yield loss, which is full control, from 92 data points, 67 from north and 25 from south of Great Eastern Highway. We divided this way, north and south, through the Great Eastern Highway. For one application of fungicide, we used 460 data points and 300 from the north and 160 from the south. For two applications, we used 138 data points and 65 from north and 73 from the south. And those cover, as you see, that many geographical locations and also the growing seasons. In those data, predominant fungicides were propiconazole and tebuconazole. In the recent trials, newer fungicide like Kawsar was used, and Geoff will mention this in his presentation. To show an example of how the data points look like, here I present the distribution of 92 data points used to calculate the yield loss. It shows the distribution is normal or normal type, which is often considered as a prerequisite to apply meta-analysis technique. You can notice here the data range from negative yield response from minus 300 kilogram per hectare to positive response 1800 kilogram per hectare. But most of the data points lie between yield response between 200 to 500 kilogram per hectare. Now Geoff will present the result.
Thank you, Kawsar, and good afternoon, everybody. As Kawsar said, she's described to you that the process that she went through to analyse a huge set of data that incorporated work from the last 30 years from people such as, I'm not sure if there's many people old enough in the room to remember Alan Brown, through Robert Lockman, Jacinta Patel, Kira Beard, Keith Josina, Bradley Peters, and any number of other people working in the Department of Agriculture. There's probably even one from Bevan Addison somewhere in there. So it's a wide range of data that Kawsar had aggregated together. One of the things that you saw from that beautiful statistician normal distribution was the range of responses that occurred. And what we have up here on the screen at the moment is a probability outlook on terms of the likelihood of the yield loss occurring in those trials. And so at any point on the graph, that's an indication that yield loss or greater will occur. And I guess there's just a couple of points I wanted to make here. Firstly, that in about probably 85% of trials there was a yield loss that occurred. Switch that around, it meant that in at least 15% of those trials there was no yield loss that occurred in those trials, which were set up as disease management trials. The median result is around that 300 kilos per hectare response, and at the other end there's about at that half a tonne yield loss, there's about 15% of those trials had a yield loss that was greater than half a tonne. So what we're indicating here is that those diseases, the septoria diseases and yellow spot, cause significant yield losses, but probably not those catastrophic yield losses as often as we might see from diseases like rust diseases. To regionalise the yield losses, we've utilised, as Kawsar suggested, we've utilised the older CBT agro-ecological zones. So we split the wheat belt into the low, medium and high rainfall zones according to the 325 and 450 mil growing season rainfall isohytes. And pretty simply, the overall outcome is that the average or median yield loss across all of those trials was about 300 kilos per hectare, which is about 11.5% yield loss through those trials, which tallies very well with the Murray and Brennan publication of a couple of years ago from GRDC,
which I think had about 12% yield loss. Obviously, of course, there was a consistent pattern from high to low rainfall in terms of yield loss, with about 15% yield loss in the high rainfall zone, about 10 in the medium rainfall zones, which equated to about 270 kilos, and minimal yield losses in the low rainfall zones. Now that low rainfall zone is a pretty small data set, and one of the issues with this analysis is that if you have a small data set, sometimes there's significant variability in it, but across those trials we only had 23 kilo average yield loss in those low rainfall zone trials. I just would point out that possibly in the high rainfall zone we may even be underestimating slightly the yield loss, because we know that the fungicide's not 100% effective, and even with the full control treatment we may still have had some yield loss in those treatments. This stands to reason, obviously, that the high rainfall zone is going to have the greatest yield loss. We're talking about fungal diseases which require moisture for sporulation and for infection to occur, so obviously zones with greater rainfall are going to have greater infection risk and therefore greater potential for yield loss. So using that same data, and again utilising the whole data set, those 460 points I think that Kawsar said, what's the story with if we apply a single fungicide? Now here we're just lumping all single fungicides together, all those products, all those rates, all those times. Basically, across all of those trials, there was about a 58% return, or reduction in yield loss, or retention of yield through an application of fungicide. So that was about 175 kilos per hectare. Interestingly, that 55 to 60% response was similar in both the high rainfall and medium rainfall zone. You might be looking at this little section here and wondering why in the low rainfall zone actually application of fungicide means that you get more yield back than you actually lost. This is part of that situation with a small data set and the fact that different trials were run in different years. But even in this, even with a larger response, we're still only getting a 38 kilo average response in the low rainfall zone. So in fact, I won't be talking about low rainfall zone responses from here on in because the fungicide responses were not a significant component. If we just use that full data set from Western Australia, so here we've got this 300 kilo loss. With one application, we're returning a 175 kilos. Two applications, we have an additional yield benefit of an extra 50 odd kilos, about 73% return of that lost yield. The second spray obviously provides an additional benefit over the first spray, but it isn't the same degree. It's proportional. It's a proportion of the first spray. So the questions are, I mean, that's the overall look. We've just taken all those trials and we've said here's the response. But the questions are, what are some of the impacts on that fungicide response? What are the driving factors that influence fungicide response? And are there some of those factors that we can control at spraying and some of those factors that we just need to be aware of when we're considering a fungicide spray? And in fact, in the control of spraying, you'll see some of these have got little asterisks on the title. You'll work out anyway which ones you can change and which ones you can't, but I've just put that in for a reminder for myself. So let's start with the fungicide itself. Okay, so that's one of the things that, one of the factors obviously, is the effect of fungicide product. Over all the trials, there was no significant difference between products. Now this again is all rates of the fungicide, and here we're looking at, and in all of the graphs from now on, we're looking at yield effect on this vertical axis, and generally we'll be looking at high versus medium rainfall response. So there was a number of fungicides used in these trials. I mean, obviously tebuconazole and propiconazole were the most commonly used, but other products such as ciproconazole, tridimethon, epoxyconazole, zoxystrobin, prothioconazole, as we've heard, and other experimental products which came out of collaborations with various chemical companies were included in this analysis. And over that whole fungicide application approach, there were no differences between the products. Response to tebuconazole and propiconazole were not significantly different. But if we do drill down a little bit into some of this, we can note that, say in the northern ag region, where yellow spot was dominant, there was a greater response in flag leaf applications from propiconazole to tebuconazole. And certainly in recent trials, as Kawsar mentioned, where we've included Prosaro in some of our recent trials, there's a trend for higher response in those trials, but that's still a small data set, so we can't be making any conclusions on that at the moment. Obviously the other fungicide issue that we have some control over is the application rate. And that's obviously, I mean, all of you out there will have been getting questions about, you know, what rate can we use, what can we get away with, and I certainly get phone calls requesting, you know, what rate is the way to go. So here we've got a comparison of propiconazole versus tebuconazole, high medium rainfall. The obvious effect there is that in the there's a rate response in the high rainfall zone. So under high disease pressure, we're getting a response to that higher rate. Across all those trials in the medium rainfall zone, there was not actually a significant rate response evident. So the implication is that under the greater disease pressure that in the higher rainfall zone, so with more infection events occurring, that with more infection opportunities, the higher rate is providing a more effective, probably more effective length of protection, if more than anything else. So certainly application rate is important, and particularly under high disease pressure. So if we move away from the fungicide and move on to when we actually put it on the crop. What's the effective growth stage of application? Now here we've got aggregation of trial results, single applications over seedling, tillering, stem extension, and then flag and beyond. And probably the most obvious trend in that data is that in the high rainfall zone, there's a trend towards a greater response to fungicide in that flag leaf spray period. So in that more traditional flag leaf spray period, and that probably stands to reason with the increased amount of infection occurring later in the season in those zones. Probably in the medium rainfall zone, we're seeing a more flat line, reflecting maybe that on the flag leaf at least, we're probably getting some interaction between onset of moisture stress and flag leaf protection, and so we're getting just a more even benefit across the growth stages. Of course, there are some intricacies in this, and one of those is that there's a trend towards greater response to fungicides later sprays in southern trials. So single application, pre-flag, flag, or post-flag. In the northern ag region, that's a fairly straight line, and possibly indicating that post-flag there's not as much benefit. But in the south, there's certainly a bit of a trend towards an increasing benefit from slightly later applications, flag and just after flag. And that's probably reflecting those later, longer season environments in those regions, and the ongoing opportunities for infection that occur well after flag leaf. What about two applications? So this is some northern ag region data, and here we've got a tillering plus a flag spray, stem extension plus a flag, and then we have flag plus heading and flag plus flowering. If we just split them into two groups at the moment, there's an obvious indication that those later sprays, a combination of later sprays, are not as effective as an earlier spray plus a flag leaf spray in that scenario. The other interesting question is obviously this tillering versus stem extension as that first spray. And certainly the indication is that there is some advantage in terms of the stem extension spray as opposed to the tillering spray in that two-spray approach in the northern ag region, and this is both high rainfall and medium rainfall data combined in this particular example. Obviously, a really important factor in development of disease is the variety resistance. And so here we've grouped varieties into what we call susceptible, so VS to S, and what we've called intermediate, so sort of the moderately susceptible type varieties. And look at the fungicide response on those in the high and medium zones. A bit of a surprise was the fact that in these trials, well, firstly there was in both zones there was a trend towards greater response in susceptible varieties than the moderately susceptible varieties. But that obviously that effect was much greater in that high rainfall, high disease environment. So that was indicating that a fungicide in the high rainfall zone on a susceptible variety was getting almost twice the return, twice the response, that you were on a moderately susceptible variety. Now, if we turn that around and look at it purely in terms of variety choice, that's indicating that there's a much more significant chance of yield loss in that susceptible variety than there is in that moderately susceptible variety in that environment, and certainly a benefit from selecting those moderately susceptible varieties for those high disease pressure environments. Just in case, we thought, well, if you're growing wheat in Wongan Hills, which is a medium rainfall zone, that doesn't mean that you're always going to get the same response because you're in that zone. Kawsar's looked at the response according to actual growing season rainfall in the trials, and what we can see is there's a very strong relationship between increasing yield response to fungicide and increasing growing season rainfall. In other words, and so what that's saying to us is that if you're in a medium rainfall zone but you're having a high rainfall season, then your response will be more like a high rainfall zone response. So the yield loss and the response is very closely related to the growing season rainfall. Most of you who've been to any talks that people such as Kira or myself have given in the last few years will have seen this, or Jat even, will have seen this discussion about the rainfall after a flag leaf application, the requirement for 80 to 100 mils after flag leaf application for a economic response. Well, obviously that economic response has reduced somewhat due to reducing fungicide prices, but certainly there is a significant response to the amount of rain that occurs after flag leaf application and the fungicide response. And we're all aware of this information previously. The reason I put this slide up is because one of the questions I always get is, well, surely that's different in the south than it is in the north. All that work was done by JAD in the north. Well, this analysis done by Kawsar has indicated that in fact that response is very similar in both the south and the north of the state. So we've had a quick look, and I know it's only a quick look, and look, there's a lot more information that Kawsar's produced, and certainly drilling down into some of those more interactions. But how do we put them all together, and how do they influence the actual response? So what Kawsar found was that by doing a regression of the data from the 1993 and 2011 seasons together, that the things on the screen here explained about 79% of the variability in yield response to one application of fungicide. Now you're going to ask me why we chose 1993 and 2011. A couple of good reasons. One is that they were 2 seasons in which we had very good data, 2 seasons in which we had variable trial responses from no response through to very good yield responses to fungicide, and also they're 20 years apart, so they're sort of old data and new data. Factors that explain that response are obviously rainfall. So rainfall zone was very important, and we've shown that. Growing season rainfall, we've shown that. One that we haven't talked about, and I do want to spend a couple of seconds addressing now, is actually rainfall that occurs in the 10 days after the application of fungicide. So this is the period at which the fungicide is just been sprayed, is probably most present and active on the leaf, and in fact Kawsar's analysis shows that the response to fungicide was greater when rainfall occurred within 10 days of that fungicide application. Certainly something in terms of spray timing that we can take into account, that if you're planning to spray your crop and it's definitely going to be raining on the weekend, there is an advantage to getting that spray on before that rain rather than after that rain. We've talked about variety susceptibility, we've talked about the importance of fungicide rate. All of these were factors which influence positively the response to fungicide. One that we haven't talked about yet is disease level at spraying. There was a very strong relationship between when there was 10% or more infection on leaf 2 at the time of spraying, had a very strong positive influence on fungicide response. Okay? So the presence of a good level of disease in the crop meant that the there was a positive influence on fungicide response. So we got more response. Probably that means that, basically what that means is there was more potential for yield loss. But interestingly, when there's disease present but less than 10% disease, the response wasn't dependent on that disease level. The response was then more dependent, or these other factors had a much greater influence on the disease response, and probably this was one of the was the key driver of that. So when there's disease in the canopy, but not yet at that sort of 10% climbing up the canopy, the old disease developing through the canopy, when there's a low level of disease, then that is very dependent on the conditions that generate further disease developing in the canopy. In terms of key messages, the average yield loss, these diseases, Septoria nodorum, or Staganospora nodorum, blotch, and yellow spot, are significant drains on wheat yields. The average yield loss over 30 years of DAFWA field trials in WA was 11.5%, equating to 300 kilos per hectare. At about $300 a tonne, that equals about $90 a hectare. That over those trials was the average loss over 30 years. Disease development and yield loss, and therefore fungicide response, are strongly related to rainfall. Fungicide application can, but won't always, recover more than half of this loss. Economic returns are possible and likely in the high and medium rainfall zones, but economic returns were generally unlikely in the low rainfall zones. And this meta-analysis approach has great potential to contribute further understanding to other issues in plant pathology. I'd like to acknowledge that the Department of Agriculture and Food, Western Australia and Grains Research Development Corporation funded this work, and obviously I've already acknowledged the work that's gone into it by various pathologists and field workers over many years. And if you have any questions and contacts, certainly these people will be happy to help you out. Thank you.